Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Max Stellman. I'm a university student intern with the Montana World Affairs Council. This is the third session of the MWAC Global Water Crisis Challenge. We're really excited to have you all here with us today. I wanted to give a special thanks to all of the schools that have turned in live today. That's schools from Plevna, from Prey, from Helena, from Stanford, Freud, Bozeman. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're really glad that you could be here to join and participate with us. Before I introduce our guest, I also want to thank the council and the classroom sponsors. Those are the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank, Trail West Bank, Northwest Energy, and Neptune Aviation. But now I want to introduce our guest. Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney is a career public servant. He served in both the Montana House and Senate and has served 3 terms as the Montana Secretary of State. As the Lieutenant Governor, Mr. Cooney works with Governor Bullock to advance the administration's agenda of better jobs, better education, and a more effective government for Montana. The Lieutenant Governor chairs the Montana Governor's Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee. That committee coordinates water supply and conditions between state and local officials and focuses primarily on managing natural resources and supporting Montanans most affected by drought. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor Cooney, for joining us today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that very kind introduction. And I am delighted to be joining all the students who are on this broadcast. It's an exciting thing for me to do, and it's a very interesting topic, and I think a very important topic that you're all engaged in. Let me just say, first to start off, we had a late night last night. As you all know, there was a special legislative session. They concluded their work around 2 o'clock in the morning. I found myself getting back home and in bed about 3 o'clock. So it was a long night, but we got some good work done, and it's now behind us, and we can get on with these other matters of importance to the state of Montana. I was going to go into a little bit of my background, but in the introduction, I think it was covered. But I have spent most of my adult career in public service. And I started when I was really in college. I was a college student, about 20 years old when I first ran for the legislature. I took an interest in it. I served as an intern, learned a lot about the legislature, and decided to throw my hat into the ring early on. And I was fortunate enough to be elected and to really start my career at a fairly young age. And it really taught me the importance of public service. It taught me how important the issues were that the legislature had to deal with, and it also taught me about some of the major issues we have to confront as a state and as a nation. So I've been very fortunate to work my way through and hold many different jobs in state government, serving in both houses of the legislature, as Secretary of State for 12 years, working in the bureaucracy, the Department of Labor for a long time, and now working my way as Governor Bullock's Lieutenant Governor. And as it was stated early on, the Lieutenant Governor does serve as the chairman of the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee. And it's something that I've taken very, very seriously, because water is an incredibly important part of who we are as a state. Obviously, you need good, clean water to survive. We also have, we're an agricultural state, and water plays a very key role on us being, a good and thriving agricultural producer. And if we don't treat our water correctly, we won't have that resource around for future generations. And I think that's really where we are this day and age. I think when most people think of their water, if you were just to walk down the street and ask people, where's your water come from? They would probably tell you, well, from my spigot in my house, from my sink. But they don't really know where the water begins and how it has to go through quite a process in order to get to your homes, in order to give you clean, fresh water. And I think that's something we've taken for granted over the years. And I think we've reached a point now where we really can no longer take this laissez-faire approach to our natural resources, and especially to water, because we know that we can run out of water, and that would be a very serious situation. Our Constitution in the state of Montana recognizes how important our natural resources are, and especially how our water is, how important our water is. And as Lieutenant Governor, this is one of the roles that I get to play for the governor, is being involved in the Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee. And we talk about this on a regular basis, and we meet, and we have our agenda is very full, and we're trying to engage more communities and other interest groups throughout the state into understanding that now is not too late to start talking about how we more properly use our water and treat our water, and to make sure that that future generations in Montana will have access to that as well. So I'm very happy to have the governor give me this responsibility, and I've taken it very seriously. As I said, water in Montana is a very important natural resource, and there's really nothing more important than clean water. Montana's economy and our quality of life really does rely on us having access to good, clean water. We love to recreate in Montana. Part of our recreation revolves around the water that we have, whether we just enjoy being on the rivers and the lakes, or if we're actively fishing, or we're taking our rafts down the river, or our kayaks. I mean, we love being surrounded by the water that we have in this state, and so it's also essential to our health and safety in Montana, and it really is a precious resource. We also in Montana, we're a headwater state, so we're responsible for a lot of the clean water that we have that runs through this country. And we need to take that responsibility very, very seriously. Glacier National Park, which is, of course, the crown jewel that we have just in our backyard, has global implications. It's the home to the only triple divide that we have in the country, and that divide allows water to flow from into the Pacific, into the Atlantic, and into the Hudson Bay. And I've lost everybody on my screen here, and I don't know if that's a problem or not. The screen just went black, so I don't know. Am I still on?
Yes, you're
okay.
Doing fine.
All righty, great, thanks. I just can't see anything right now.
Okay.
So in any event, it just, really, not only for us here in Montana is water important, but really our water stretches throughout the continent, and it's very important that we are good stewards of that resource. Let me tell you just about a couple of the things that I've been involved in most recently. I also serve on a committee that deals with a water system that is up in the northern part, in the High Line of Montana. It's called the St. Mary's Water System. And that system really feeds that part of the state for its water. And so we're talking many, many communities from Havre all the way over to Glasgow, Browning, and so forth. That water starts in the United States, it ends up in Canada and Alberta, and it comes back into the United States. That system, we built that canal system over 100 years ago. And we in the United States have not done a whole lot to keep that canal system modern. It's a 100-year-old system. It's a phenomenal system to visit and to see what we did 100 years ago, and we can be proud of that. But that system is 100 years old. There are failures. It does not allow us to conserve water as we should, or to use that water, or to have reasonable amount of water when we need it. And so we've been working with our partners in Canada, as well as all the users up on that canal system in the St. Mary's region, to make sure that we're doing everything we can. But we're looking at modernizing that, and it would cost literally billions of dollars to do anything.
All right, I think that we're good. Thank you very much, Kathleen. Okay, bye.
So the bottom line is we're working on with water from that. Here I am. We're working on water issues at that level, community, making sure that our agricultural communities have access to water so that we can continue to produce, and that the small communities all along the High Line will have the ability to continue to thrive, grow, and just allow people to have access to those waters. It's an old system. We've got a lot of work to do. But we continue to work with the federal government and all the other people who are involved, all the communities in that area, because without that canal system up there, I don't know what the folks would do for access to clean and good water. So that's something that we do, that I'm involved with, and it's very interesting. The other thing, as part of it, I had the opportunity to visit Canada, southern Alberta. They're just our neighbors right across the border, and they're heavily into agriculture, and they've developed their water systems up there and modernized them, and they've spent billions of dollars to do this because they realize just how important the water is up there, so that they can grow the crops that they need and they can have diversity. And it's a huge part of their economy. I had a chance to go up and talk to those folks up in Alberta, and it's very impressive to see a country, or in this case, a province of Canada, who has recognized that they cannot just go it alone. They can't just, depend on the goodwill of people, but that they have to make an investment and make sure that they have the finest infrastructure in order to make sure that they have the resources that they need. And it is amazing to see what they're growing up there. It's amazing to see the companies that have placed manufacturing up there because they want to be near the crops to be able to, everything like potato chip companies, and they make potato chips. There's French fry companies up there, and they have manufacturers up there. Creates great jobs. It's using their resources very wisely. And even though, and through their investment, although they have a lot of water now, they're they're very good at conserving the water. They're not using as much water as they once did. So they're producing far more than they've ever produced, and yet they're doing so with less water, and that's, I think, a very good thing. So I think that's kind of where I think our focus needs to be. And I think, and it's been, again, a pretty exciting part of what I get to do. I wasn't an expert. I don't want you to think I am an expert. I'm learning every day as I work on these issues, and I have to say it's something that I've gained great appreciation for. We can't talk about water in Montana without talking about drought, because as you probably, many of you in the areas in which you live, you probably experienced a pretty nasty drought this summer. And I want to talk a little bit about that and what that means about our water supply. The drought that we had this summer was probably one of the worst droughts that we saw in modern history in Montana. As a result of those droughts, we also saw Montana had one of the worst fire seasons. Over $75 million of state resources had to go into our efforts to fight forest fires throughout the state. And when you really look at all of the dollars that were spent by all agencies, federal and state, we're anticipating that the bill will actually be over $400 million. That's a lot of money. That's we're talking real money there, and that's public money. So when we have a drought like we had, and then followed by which really encouraged and helped these fires and the fire season that we had, we need to be very, very concerned about that. And I anticipate really that we're probably going to see this pattern kind of continue. I don't know that we're going to be able to say that we just had a tough fire season this year and we had a bad drought, but perhaps next year it's going to be okay. I think we're going to continue to see this pattern continue as we see the wet weather and the climate change over the course, as we've seen in the last several years. We've seen almost every month this last year was one of the hottest months on record since we've been tracking these things. So we're seeing this pattern occur. And that's going to be a real issue that we have to deal with. I did mention the expensive and long-term fires that we put up with. What was so surprising about this, and this is why we have to be prepared. Last winter, we saw one of the best snowpacks that we've seen in a long time. Over 200% of normal snowpack in the Yellowstone River Basin alone. I think most of the basins that we looked at were either at normal or above normal, with the exception of one. And the Smith River Basin was a little below normal. But overall, we went into this last summer seeing a really fine snowpack, which is really where our water comes from, is from our snowpack. The other key is that we got to see that snowpack melt at the right time. We have to see those flows come down, and if they come down too early, that water just pretty much comes in, leaves Montana, and we're out of luck. If it comes down when we need it to come down, which it did this year, then we see our rivers fill and our reservoirs fill, and we're able to access that water for agriculture and those other uses for the water. This year, it looked like it was going to be absolutely perfect. In fact, there was a meeting in Missoula early on where we had some of our best fire experts come together, and they looked at all of the things that you look at as you're trying to plan for the fire season, and every one of them said, this looks like it's going to be a fabulous fire year. We're going to have, we always have fires, but nothing's going to happen too drastically. We should be in really good shape. We shouldn't have to spend too much in our resources. And yet, very, very quickly, we saw that change. And it started in up in the northeastern corner of the state. And what happened is part of the state, especially in the northeastern corner and the eastern side of the state, we depend on getting fairly heavy spring rains to help with the water situation over there. So with the snowpack and the heavy spring rains, we're usually in pretty good shape. We didn't see any spring rains. And along with not seeing spring rains, we saw the temperatures rise and we saw the winds come in. And we started to see things dry out really, really quickly. I learned a new term this summer, which I'd never heard before, and that's called a flash drought. Which we hear of flash flooding, we hear of those sorts of things, but all of a sudden we're talking about something called a flash drought. And we could literally watch on mapping how this drought was developing. And you could just see it happen in the northeastern part of the state, and then it started to work even further south, coming further west, and literally in a matter of weeks, we saw this flash drought engulf basically the entire state of Montana. Now, there were parts of the state that were hit much harder than other parts, but still, we saw this happen, and there was probably not an area that was not absolutely looking as if it wasn't going to be suffering from some sort of drought. So we had to deal with that as a result. Now, we call this an agricultural drought, what we saw, because really the soils dried out, but our rivers were running pretty good because we did have a decent snowpack. It melted when it needed to. So a lot of the rivers and lakes were in pretty good shape throughout the summer. But the water that agriculture was depending on was in very, very short supply. Crops were not growing. If they planted crops, if they got the crops in, we saw those crops never really take off. Things started to die off. People who raise cattle and sheep and so forth, they weren't able to grow enough feed. It affected the whole agricultural economy of Montana. And so
Lieutenant Governor, could I interrupt really quickly?
You may.
I'm really curious about the communities that we have on right now and how the drought, if it did, affected their communities and what they have seen with water stress in their communities, if they have. And so I'd love for these groups to take a minute, turn and talk, and we'll give you about 30 seconds, and I'd like to have one representative from each class go ahead and share with the Lieutenant Governor what you've seen in your community. And then after that, I'm curious if what your community has done about it, if anything.
Right. No, I think that would be great because I want to touch on community activity. Thank you.
All right, we'll give about 15 more seconds. Okay, if you're ready to go, give me a thumbs up. All right, Chinook, I see your thumbs up first off. So we're going to start with Chinook, then we're going to move to Plevin, we're going to go to Bozeman, and then Helena. So go ahead, Chinook.
Lieutenant Governor, so this year we've seen a lot of droughts. Our crop didn't bring as much crop this year. The market's been down this year, and it's been really dry this year, and we've been trying to get the water up, but it's been really dry here.
Well, I'm sure it has been, and I've been up in the Chinook area during the drought, and I know exactly what you're talking about. And you know, that's exactly what you felt in the Chinook area has been felt throughout the state of Montana. So you understand how serious it is. Thank you very much for that comment.
All right, let's move to Plevin, please. Plevna, excuse me. Plevna, I think you're muted. Yep. We still can't hear you. We could hear you at the beginning, though.
we got to hear from Plevna.
I know. Technology is wonderful when it works. Let's do this. We're going to go to Bozeman, and then we're going to come back to Plevna. Okay, Bozeman, are you ready?
All right. It says my mic's
Yes,
off.
we're ready.
Can you hear us now?
We can. We'll stick with Bozeman, then we're going to come back to you, Plevna.
Okay, great.
Wait, so it's on. Do I press anything?
You can.
We can hear you,
on.
Bozeman.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so what we were discussing was like in regards to agriculture. What's interesting is Bozeman is actually like a far more urban area than most of Montana. So, you know, I guess locally we don't actually experience the effects of drought, you know, super immediately. But if you just go a little bit outside of Bozeman and you look at a lot of the more agrarian agricultural areas, you can definitely see a strain on resources and how the drought has impacted those areas. But is it okay if I ask a question in regards to that?
Certainly.
Please.
Okay, so in regards to actually like alleviating these kinds of issues, like what kind of legislation do you actually pass when you see individuals like, you know, farmers or agriculturalists who have like strained resources, and they rely on like water usage for their output? Like, do you use like tax-based like incentive legislation, or do you use like regulation legislation?
Well, I think right now there's probably more regulation working with people, but what the approach that we take on water, it's a great question, and I think it's a great question coming from Bozeman because I want to really shout out to Bozeman. The city of Bozeman has done probably more than a lot of communities have in preparing for the drought situation. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and I think it's a good example of how we do it. One of the things that we need to do, in my opinion, more than legislate and regulate, is just to work with communities to plan better. The folks who live in, you know, Bozeman, the folks who live in Plevna, the folks who live in Chinook or wherever they live, they know what their water needs are. They know that the city or the towns are going to need so much water to keep people, you know, residential use up and give people enough water to live. They know what their agricultural needs are going to be. They also know that part of it is recreation and our fisheries. We've got to keep those healthy as well. But it's a balance it's a balance of all of these things. More than having the state government come down and say, you have to do it this way, what we're trying to do is get communities to come together, get their water users together, get their interested parties together to develop a plan that will work for them. So that because drought is going to happen. It's not maybe if it happens we'll be prepared. It is going to happen. Everybody is going to experience, and it's going to happen off and on. So you need to be prepared, and you need to have a plan for it. And so that's why you need to bring agriculture and your cities and your recreationalists together to say, when it happens, How are we going to divide things up? What steps are we going to take? And Bozeman's done a great job of this. They already have a plan in place that says if certain things happen and we see our water start to, our drought situation starts to become a problem, there's different levels. And they will kick certain things into place, which they decided as a community they would do. And I don't know the entire plan, in detail, but I've talked to them and I've worked with them, and it's a great thing because once it reaches a certain level, then certain groups will say we're going to give up this amount of water, so we make sure we have enough water going to agriculture and enough water going to the fisheries. But we're also going to make sure, so we might cut back on sprinkling our lawns. We may say to people, don't wash your cars this much. We may ask people, don't flush your toilets every time you use it. And then agriculture may say, well, okay, we won't ask for us to be able to draw down X amount of water. If we can just get this much, if we're willing to conserve that as well. So that's, I think, the best approach that can be taken right now is to engage individual communities who understand their needs to come together and to develop a plan before the drought hits. Because in the middle of a drought, it's too late. That's when people start to fight and they don't understand. But when you can have these conversations and to develop a plan, that is a far better approach than trying to do something either legislatively where you're telling people you must do it this way, because we don't know what's best for your community. We don't know what's best for Chinook. So it's better if it's developed, and that's really the approach that we're taking from the state side, which I think makes a heck of a lot of sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
And you all need to be involved in this discussion as well. And the reason you need to be involved is because this is your future. We may mess it up. And if we mess it up, we're messing it up for you. So when you see that these meetings are taking place or these discussions are taking place, I hope young people are involved in those discussions because it's your future.
Lieutenant Governor Cooney, we have a lot of these students, and I know Bozeman is one of them, Chinook also, that are working on the water challenge, and they are trying to come up with a bunch of solutions. And so I'd like to ask if it would be okay if we could send you some of their solutions when they get to the end of their challenge as part of this process.
I would love that. And in fact, I will tell you, as the Drought Advisory Council is... right now, they have a website that people can go on, and we're gathering information where people can tell us about what's happening in their local areas, what the effect of the drought was, what they're seeing as we may be coming out of a drought a little bit. Although I can tell you, it's going to take us a long time to come out of this drought. We would love to hear what the students have to say and what their plans are and what their thoughts are, and I'll guarantee you there'll be some great ideas there.
Oh, I know there will. Let's go ahead and move on to Plevna and then up to Helena. We lost you again.
Thank you.
Oh, you're back.
Thank you. All right, can you hear us?
Excellent.
All right. Are we good to go? Awesome.
We are.
We've got a couple of questions and just one or two comments for the governor.
Okay.
Okay, so Jesse's going to start on just commenting on the effect that the droughts had here in eastern Montana, and then we've got a couple of questions for you, Governor.
Thank you.
So the ranchers have had to sell their cows, and the crops have not turned out how the ranchers would want them. And since there was a drought, they had to sell their cows, and the grass just failed. And they had to sell their cows and buy hay.
So. In the fires.
Yeah, maybe saying relief or anything like that they could provide.
So I think that his comment here, Governor, was like, it's been pretty hard hit here in eastern Montana, and he was wondering whether there was any relief for the farmers that the state of Montana would provide. Is everyone jammed?
Nope. We can see you and hear you. And I think we can see most people. He's frozen.
Did you guys get the question?
we got the question. I'm not sure the lieutenant governor did.
Oh, oopsie. Okay.
You know, you don't see him. I think his call dropped, so we're gonna have to get him reconnected. But while we're doing that, what I'd like you guys to do, is I'd like you to go ahead and talk amongst your class about some of the solutions that you see as students. Sort of like he was asking, what is your input? And see if you can come up with a couple of those, and while we get him connected, and then we'll hear class to class a little bit about what some of those solutions are in our community. And we'll be back in just a moment, hopefully with the Lieutenant Governor.
Okay.
Okay, you're back.
I apologize. We got frozen and kicked off, so I'm back though. Sorry,
Wonderful.
Plevna.
Plevna, would you go ahead and re-ask that question, please?
Okay, I'll state it for the Lieutenant Governor. Welcome back, Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you.
Our student was just commenting that, the drought in eastern Montana has had a big effect. A lot of ranchers here have had to sell their cattle and cut down on livestock herds, etc., etc. And, it's been pretty difficult times for them here. And, they wanted to know whether there was anything, that the Montana state has done to maybe help with this crisis, whether it'll be federal funding or disaster management relief.
Well, one of the things that we have done is throughout the process of the drought, the governor did have to, make declarations. When the governor makes declarations that there is drought at certain levels and so forth, that then there are certain federal programs that can be brought into place. And so with those drought declarations, those things, we've worked very closely with the federal government and any agencies to help bring what resources are available. I'm going to have to be very honest. There's not a lot of money floating around in either the federal or state government that just brings financial assistance, but there are low interest loan programs and there are things like that through the FSA. And I think that we've tried very hard to get that information out. And if you're not aware of any of those things, you can certainly call. You can call the state. You can call the governor's office or email us, and we can put you and your families in touch with those resources. And hopefully you might find something that will give you a little bit of relief. But quite honestly, if a lot of people were asking, are there programs out there where there's pots of money where we can just get assistance? And there's not, but there are some programs that may prove to be helpful to families and to individuals who are having issues.
Okay. And then one of our other students has also just got a question for you.
Yes.
Okay, she's going to come up. We do have an 80s dress style theme week for Spirit Week this
Excellent.
week. So
I remember
some
those
of our
days.
students are dressed interesting.
I lived through those days.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question for you is, do you know why the governor didn't call in the National Guard sooner for the fires that have been going on?
Well, first of all, I think the governor did call in the National Guard when the resources were requested. You don't want the governor just out there calling in National Guard willy-nilly. We have the federal government was involved, the U.S. Forest Service, the Department of Natural Resources, many of the state and federal agencies that participate in the fire resources. It's a big group. They come together, they examine what's happening, they look at what resources they need, and they then basically come to the governor and say, eventually, we think it would be good if you could call up the National Guard. And typically some of the services that the National Guard provide are security at fire zones. They can go out We do train them when needed to go out to learn how to dig lines and to be a part of the fighting the fire, but that's not their main purpose. So when the governor was asked by the fire management team, which was everybody in federal and state government working these fires, when they finally came and said, Governor, we'd like you to bring in the National Guard, the governor did, and the National Guard played a very important role. So the governor's not going to do it until he is told by the experts who are out on the ground fighting the fire. They're the ones that are going to really ask him to pull the trigger and bring the Guard in, and he did when they asked.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great question.
Let's move over to Helena, close to home.
We on? We're good? We're good?
There you go.
Lieutenant Governor.
Hello, Mr. Cooney.
It's an honor to talk to you. I've heard great things about you, so keep up the good work. Great questions coming from all different schools, and clearly this is an important issue. I have kind of a two-part question. We've been discussing this amongst ourselves. And first of all, we're wondering, being that Helena is a capital city, what are you seeing as far as, preparation in the Lewis and Clark area, Helena overall? Is it something we're preparing for? I mean, the valley is very big, agriculturally speaking, and do you think that we're doing what we need to be doing, first of all? And then second of all, as a state, do you think that we are overall doing what we should be doing, or has there been some resistance at the local level to, take some of these precautionary measures that you've discussed a little bit?
All righty. Well, thank you. And to be perfectly transparent about this for everybody else, the person who just asked the question happens to be my oldest son. So I need to let you know that. There you go. Thanks. He's never been that polite to me before, so I'm surprised. No, it's a good question, and I'm glad your students have brought it up. I think we need to do better in Helena. I think probably the one community who has really done the most in the state, as I mentioned earlier, is Bozeman. And I'm always out there telling communities, please contact the Bozeman water people and talk to them because they have a great model to use. Every community needs to be better prepared. And I think Helena, as well as most of the other communities in Montana, really need to take a good hard look at this particular question to figure out what they're going to do, not only about drought, but proper use of water and how they're going to prepare for the changes that we anticipate happening as water becomes more and more scarce. So I think I would love to see the students on this program reach out to their local communities and encourage their local communities to start having these discussions. Perhaps you could even help lead this discussion because of the information that you've put together throughout the course of this program. So no, we're not there yet. And across the state, we're not there yet. And it's a big focus. And as I'm out visiting with people and talking about drought and water usage and so forth, I am constantly encouraging communities to make this a priority. And it's a hard thing for them to do. We don't typically like to look at things until it becomes a crisis. Well, we can't afford to let the water issue become a crisis before we start talking. That will be too late. And so that's why we need to be looking ahead, knowing that we're going to continue to face drought, we're going to continue to face water shortages, and there's going to be conflict when we do that. And so we need to answer these questions and have a plan before we get there. Thank you. Thanks, Helena.
Thank you. So, Chinook, you haven't had an opportunity to ask any questions, so I want to go back to Chinook to see if you have some questions for Lieutenant Governor.
Okay, go ahead. You're on.
Oh.
Hi, Chinook.
So what are you guys doing about the water crisis, and what can we do to help with it?
Well, and thank you. That's a good question. I think that first of all, I think you're the future of Montana. You're the ones that are going to have to deal with the problems that we don't solve. So I think, what I would ask you to do is I would ask you to talk to the people in your community. Go to your city council. Talk, keep learning about water and the importance and what we can do to preserve and protect what we have, but at the same time share that information with the people in your community. And then I think you need to say, folks, we need you, and we're willing to work with you. I think you need to work with them. We need you to help develop the right plan so that we have security. We have water security so that when we grow up and we are living in the area that we want to live in, whether it's Chinook or anywhere on the High Line or someplace else in Montana, that we are going to be assured that we have access to the water so we can live the lives we want to live, that we can enjoy the fisheries and our water resources as we recreate in Montana. And when we want to, continue our lifestyle in agriculture, whether we're growing crops or we're raising cattle and sheep and other animals for our livelihood, we can't do it without water. So we need to start being responsible about it now. That is what I think you can do, and you've put yourselves in a great position to kind of lead the charge and to get the grown-ups, the adults in your community, to be focused on this more than they are right now. Thanks, Chinook.
Thank you. So we're going to go through another round of questions because I think there's a lot of very interesting points that have been brought up. But I'd also like to ask, as we're going through this round of questions, if you have a question for another school or another community, you could also ask that as well. So let's go back. We lost Bozeman. They had to leave. Their class schedule changed. So we're going to go back to Plevna, then we're going to go back up to Helena, and then we're going to come back down to Chinook. So we're going to go ahead and start with you, Plevna.
Okay, so we have a chance to ask the governor more questions. Is that what I understand?
We can do that.
Okay. One of my students has a question. Cooper has a question for the governor. Come on up, Cooper.
No, I don't.
All right.
I don't remember it.
Cooper.
I don't remember it.
Okay. I'll help you out if you have trouble with it. You guys have to. Communication is the big thing about the world going forward. So, about the bottled water. Okay, his question is a little shy, except in class where he's very loud and noisy. Other than that, so his question, he watched a documentary during study hall today on bottled water and the effects and the problems of bottled water, and he wanted to know whether Montana has any regulations, because ultimately this is our drinking water.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I don't believe there's any real regulations on bottled water. I know that we have some bottled water plants in Montana, and I know that there's people talking about even developing more, which concerns some people. It's been not without controversy, because when you bottle water and you sell it off, you're getting that water from someplace, and people believe that it's depleting water that's necessary for the local area it's coming from, and so they're concerned about it. I think there are some people who would argue perhaps the state needs to be more involved in this discussion. There are some regulations and things. We do have to regulate it to a certain point regarding quality. Will it dewater the system? And so those things are looked at. But I would say overall, there's probably not a lot of strong regulation in Montana at this point that could really have a huge impact on that particular aspect of our water usage. I mean, obviously, I think people are more and more becoming sensitive to the fact that we're producing a lot of plastic, and we're trying to get away from encouraging people to get them away from using as much bottled water as we have been. That's from the plastic standpoint. But it does take water. That water has to come from someplace, and it does use that water for that purpose, which means that water's not there wherever they're getting it from to be used for the purposes they need locally. So it is a controversial thing, but I don't know that the state law has really kept up with that as much as you might think that we need to.
Okay, thank you very much, Governor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move over to Helena.
Okay, we good to go. Okay, so here's the deal. We were just kind of wondering about like invasive species like the zebra mussels, and like if drought would affect those at all, or if those are just kind of something that come and go, and like if they've been found in any lakes around Montana.
It's a huge issue. It's a huge problem, and Montana has had to spend a lot of money in the last legislative session, not the special session, but the regular session before. We had to appropriate, I don't remember what the amount was, but it was a large amount of money to try and prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. Zebra mussels, you're all familiar with those, obviously. And there are other problems that we have, even plant invasive species out there. So does drought have anything to do with that? It could be. I mean, I would say what we find is if when there's drought and there's heat and water temperatures go up, it really kind of produces an unhealthy water situation. So we'll see fish die-offs as we did down in the Yellowstone last year, where we had hundreds of thousands of whitefish die off, and it was basically because of the heat in the rise of the temperature of the water, and the level of the water was not as where it should be, and the fish then developed diseases and they started to die off. I don't know if it creates a better atmosphere or system for aquatic invasive species to grow and prosper, but I have to believe that anytime our water sources become unhealthy, bad things happen, so it's not good. What we're really trying to do on aquatic invasive species is prevent it from coming into the state. There have been some tests run in a couple areas. I think Tiber Reservoir is one. The Missouri outside of Helena here, Canyon Ferry. There have been some tests that have shown that it is a possibility. There are some signs that there could be some aquatic invasive species showing up there, but we have not, as best I remember, I don't believe that we have actually found any mussels or any other forms of aquatic invasive species in our waters at this point, where we've actually found the little, shells and all of that. We're out there monitoring it. We have a lot of monitoring going on right now, but the big thing is we have a lot of people who bring boats into the area, and we need to make sure that we're asking those people to stop at inspection stations. So we ask them where they were where their boats were in the water. If they come in from out of state, they have to clean the boats. They have to clean their wells out. A lot of boats have the water wells in them, and so we need them to clean those out. And just that effort alone is massive in a state of Montana. But we feel it's worth it because, again, our waterways are too important to allow these aquatic invasive species to overtake them. And we just outside our borders, and we know they're there. And at some point, we very likely will find some. But at this point, I don't believe that we have found any absolute sign of aquatic invasive species. But we're monitoring it regularly throughout the year. Any other questions? Thank you, Helena.
Thank you. Let's go down to Chinook, and then I think this is our last question that we have time for the day. So go ahead, Chinook.
Back to the sugar beeters.
Yeah. Is there anything in place to make sure livestock is getting enough water in time of drought?
That's a great question, and it kind of goes back to my earlier comments. It depends on where you live and how active the water users in your areas are working together. And I think everybody wants to make sure that in a drought, that everybody is getting as much water as they can afford to give them. You don't want to shut down water for agriculture and let everything dry up and put everything in into the rivers for the fisheries. But you need to share that water, but you need to have a plan to do it. And then your communities also are big water users. your residential areas and so forth. So that's why it's so important that you have a community effort that makes decisions early on that if a drought or when a drought occurs and at what level it occurs, you're going to know what steps you're going to take so that you can share that water to the best of your ability so that no one it goes without, because we cannot afford to let that happen. We may need to cut it back. We may need to figure out ways of distributing it differently, but we need to figure out ways, and local communities are the best people to do that, on how to use that water wisely.
Lieutenant Governor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our schools, too, for some really phenomenal questions. And I look forward to hearing solutions from these schools as well. So we really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you very much. And I got to tell you, although sometimes it's like pulling teeth to get communities to have these discussions, seeing these students and hearing them gives me great hope that we're going to see some progress made. Please work with us, be involved, students, and look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking the Lieutenant Governor today.